Look closely at the eyes around you, your friends, your family, maybe even your own reflection, and you'll notice something strange. Some eyelids seem to vanish entirely, swallowed by a fold of skin that hides the crease underneath. For decades, people called this a flaw, something to fix, something to hide. But scientists have finally traced this feature back through evolution, genetics, and even a single microscopic change in human DNA that happened tens of thousands of years ago. And what they found is far stranger and far more fascinating than anyone expected. To understand hooded eyes, you first have to understand what a normal, unhooded eyelid actually looks like. Beneath your eyebrow sits a thin layer of skin, then a layer of muscle, then a pad of fat, and finally the eyelid itself, which folds neatly along a crease when you open your eyes. In most faces, that crease stays visible. You can see it clearly whether the eyes are open or closed. But in a hooded eye, extra skin drapes down from the brow bone and settles right over that crease, hiding it from view. Sometimes it covers the whole eyelid, sometimes just the outer corner. Either way, the result is the same. The eye looks smaller, the lid looks heavier, and the crease disappears beneath a soft fold of loose skin. For years, this was treated purely as a cosmetic issue, something magazines told people to conceal with clever eyeliner tricks or correct with surgery. But researchers digging into human anatomy, genetics, and evolutionary history discovered that hooded eyes are not a mistake of nature. They are the product of very deliberate biological processes, some of which trace back tens of thousands of years to ancestors surviving in extreme environments. Let's start with the anatomy, because that's where the real story begins. Your eyelid isn't just skin, it's a complex structure built from several layers working together. There's the orbital septum, a thin membrane that separates the eye socket from the eyelid. There's orbital fat, a cushion of soft tissue that gives your eye area, volume, and shape. There's the levator muscle, responsible for lifting your eyelid so you can open your eyes. And there's skin, which varies enormously in thickness and elasticity from person to person. In someone with a classic double eyelid, the levator muscle attaches to the skin close to the eyelash line, creating that familiar crease you see when your eyes are open. But in someone with hooded eyes, one of two things typically happens. Either the orbital fat sits higher and thicker than usual, pushing down and forward, or the skin above the eye is simply looser and more abundant, folding downward under its own weight. Sometimes it's a combination of both. The muscle still works exactly the way it should. Vision isn't affected. It's purely a matter of where the tissue sits and how much of it there is, a subtle difference in internal architecture that produces a strikingly different appearance on the surface, even though the eye itself functions identically either way. Understanding these layers matters because it explains why two people can have wildly different eyelid shapes despite having eyes that are structurally built from the exact same components. It's a bit like two houses built from identical materials, but arranged in different proportions. One house might have a slightly larger roof overhang, another a slightly deeper foundation, and the overall silhouette ends up looking completely different even though nothing about the underlying materials has changed. The same is true of eyelids. The amount of fat, the thickness of the skin, the exact attachment point of the levator muscle, and the underlying bone structure of the brow all interact to produce an almost infinite range of possible eyelid shapes, hooded being just one point along that spectrum. Now here's where things get genuinely fascinating, because scientists wanted to know why some populations have far higher rates of this feature than others, and why it seems to run so strongly in families. The answer, it turns out, lies buried inside a single gene called EDAR. EDAR might not sound like the kind of gene you'd expect to be involved in eyelid shape. It's primarily known for regulating the development of skin, hair follicles, teeth, and sweat glands. But researchers studying population genetics discovered something remarkable. A single amino acid change within this gene, just one tiny alteration in a string of genetic code, appears to have swept through East Asian populations sometime between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago, and it didn't just change one thing. It changed many things at once. This particular variant of EDAR increases the activity of a signaling pathway involved in tissue development. That single tweak in DNA is associated with thicker, straighter hair. It's linked to changes in tooth shape, including a distinctive shoveling pattern seen on the back of the incisors. It's connected to differences in chin and ear structure. It even affects the density of sweat glands in the fingertips. And, crucially, it appears to influence how fat is distributed around the eye socket, and how the eyelid forms during development, which is one of the strongest genetic threads connecting to hooded eyes and the related epicanthic fold, that small fold of skin at the inner corner of the eye that often appears alongside hooding. What's remarkable here isn't just that one gene affects the eyelid, it's that one single genetic change reached across the entire body, from hair to teeth to sweat glands to eyes, all at once. In genetics, this is called pleiotropy, when a single gene influences multiple, seemingly unrelated traits. and EDAR is one of the most striking examples of pleiotropy ever discovered in human evolution. To put that into perspective, imagine flipping a single switch in a massive electrical panel and discovering that it doesn't just turn on one light, but simultaneously adjusts the thermostat, changes the water pressure, and rewires part of the plumbing, all from that one flip. That's essentially what happened when this variant of EDAR spread through ancient populations. The change meant to tweak one developmental pathway ended up leaving fingerprints across the entire body, visible today in hair samples, dental records, and yes, the shape of the eyelid itself. Researchers studying ancient DNA have even been able to trace this variant backward through time, comparing it against skeletal remains and inferred physical traits to build a timeline of roughly when and where it likely first appeared and how quickly it spread outward from there. So why would this variant become so common in certain populations in the first place? This is where evolutionary biologists start looking at climate, survival, and natural selection, and where the story gets a little more speculative, because scientists don't fully agree yet. One leading hypothesis focuses on heat and humidity. The idea is that the EDAR variant's effect on sweat gland density may have provided a real survival advantage in hot, humid environments, where efficient cooling through perspiration could mean the difference between thriving and struggling. Under this theory, the changes to hair, teeth, and eyelids came along for the ride, as side effects of a mutation that was primarily being selected for its impact on sweating and thermoregulation. Another hypothesis points in the opposite direction entirely, toward cold, not heat. This theory suggests that as populations moved into Central and Northern Asia roughly 30,000 years ago, facing brutal winters and extreme temperature swings, additional fat around the eyes may have offered protection. Thicker fat pads around the eye socket could help insulate delicate tissue from frostbite and wind exposure, while a fuller, rounder eyelid shape may have reduced heat loss from the face, one of the most exposed and vulnerable parts of the human body in freezing conditions. Under this view, the hooded, fuller eyelid shape wasn't an accident. It was armor against the cold. Neither hypothesis has been definitively proven, and scientists are honest about that uncertainty. What they do agree on is that natural selection acted fast and acted hard. The frequency of this EDAR variant rose to near universal levels in East Asian populations within what is, evolutionarily speaking, an extremely short window of time. That kind of rapid spread almost always signals a strong survival advantage, something powerful enough that individuals carrying the variant were more likely to survive and pass on their genes than those without it. There's actually a third hypothesis that some researchers find compelling, one that doesn't focus on a single environmental pressure at all, but instead on a combination of several smaller advantages stacking together. Under this view, the EDAR variant may never have provided one single overwhelming benefit, but rather several modest advantages across sweating efficiency, cold protection, dental structure, and hair thickness, each one contributing a small survival edge that added up over generations into a much larger overall effect. Evolution doesn't always work through one dramatic pressure. Sometimes it works through many quiet, compounding nudges, each one barely noticeable on its own, but powerful when combined across thousands of years and countless generations. This kind of multi-factor selection is notoriously difficult to prove definitively, which is part of why scientists remain cautious about declaring a single, tidy explanation for why this particular variant became so successful. But hooded eyes aren't confined to one population, and this is a critical point that researchers have worked hard to clarify, especially given how often this trait gets stereotyped or oversimplified in casual conversation. Hooded eyelids and epicanthic folds appear across an enormous range of human populations. They show up frequently among people of Asian descent, yes, but they also appear in Finnish and Baltic populations, in various indigenous communities across the Americas, in certain African ethnic groups, and in plenty of people of European and mixed ancestry as well. Genetics doesn't respect the neat categories we like to draw around race and ethnicity. Traits like eyelid shape exist on a spectrum, shaped by a mix of inherited genes, not a single switch that flips on or off based on ancestry alone. Researchers studying populations with mixed genetic backgrounds have found some of the clearest evidence for this. Take Uyghur populations, for example, which carry both East Asian and West Eurasian genetic ancestry. Studies show that the frequency of the EDAR variant in this group sits at an intermediate level, and so does the visibility of the epicanthic fold. Individuals with 2 copies of the East Asian variant tend to show a fuller, more complete fold, while those with just 1 copy often show a partial or intermediate fold. This kind of graded, dose-dependent pattern is exactly what you'd expect if a specific gene variant is directly influencing the trait. And it gives scientists strong confidence that they're looking at real biology, not just correlation. Similar patterns show up in Latino populations with significant indigenous American ancestry, where epicanthic folds appear in roughly half of individuals studied, with the fold typically originating from a specific structural point along the eyelid The prevalence tracks closely with the degree of indigenous ancestry in these populations, reinforcing the idea that this is fundamentally a story about inherited genetics passed down through specific ancestral lineages, appearing wherever those lineages exist, regardless of the broader ethnic labels we tend to apply. These findings carry an important lesson that extends well beyond eyelids. Human traits, almost universally, don't sort neatly into the categories we've historically used to divide people into groups. A feature like hooded eyes might be common in one population and rare in another, but it exists on a continuous gradient shaped by ancestry, migration, and interbreeding across thousands of years, not by any clean binary genetic switch. Every time researchers study a trait closely enough, whether it's skin tone, height, hair texture, or eyelid shape, they find the same pattern repeating. Variation within any single population is often just as significant as variation between different populations, and traits blend, mix, and distribute themselves in ways that resist simple categorization. Hooded eyes are simply one especially visible example of this much broader biological truth, a reminder that the neat boxes we like to draw around human diversity rarely match the messier, more interconnected reality of our shared genetic history. It's also worth pausing here to bust a persistent myth. Hooded eyes and epicanthic folds have absolutely nothing to do with vision quality or eye health. Researchers who conducted visual acuity studies specifically on people with and without pronounced epicanthic folds found no meaningful difference in visual field or clarity. Your eyes work exactly the same, whether or not there's extra skin draping over the crease. The fold is purely structural and cosmetic in terms of function. It doesn't block your central line of sight, doesn't impair peripheral vision in any measurable way, and has zero connection to visual acuity, color perception, or eye health in general. This matters because, for generations, this trait was tangled up in harmful stereotypes and misconceptions, treated as something odd or lesser, when in reality it's simply one more example of the vast natural variation present in human anatomy. Now, genetics explains a huge portion of why some people are born with hooded eyes from infancy, often visible even in baby photos, long before any aging process could possibly be involved. But genetics isn't the whole story, because plenty of people develop hooded eyes later in life, even if they didn't have them as children or young adults. This is where the second major thread of the research comes in, and it has far less to do with ancient DNA and far more to do with the everyday biology of aging. As we get older, our skin gradually loses two critical structural proteins, collagen and elastin. Collagen provides strength and structure, while elastin, as its name suggests, allows skin to stretch and then snap back into place. Together, they're responsible for keeping skin firm, tight, and resilient. But production of both declines steadily with age, and by the time most people reach their 40s or 50s, the skin around the eyes, which is already among the thinnest and most delicate skin on the entire body, has lost a significant portion of its elasticity. At the same time, the muscles supporting the eyebrows begin to lose tone. Just like muscles elsewhere in the body, the tiny muscles holding the brow in its youthful position weaken over decades of use, and gravity does the rest. As the brow gradually droops, even by a few millimeters, it pushes down on the soft tissue and fat that sit above the eye socket. That downward pressure forces the skin below the eyebrow to fold and settle over the eyelid crease, creating exactly the same visual effect as the genetic version of hooded eyes, even though the underlying cause is completely different. Researchers studying this age-related process have identified several contributing factors beyond simple time passing. Chronic sun exposure accelerates the breakdown of collagen and elastin fibers, meaning people with significant lifetime sun exposure often develop hooding earlier and more noticeably than those who've been more protected. Repeated facial movements, including something as simple as habitually rubbing your eyes, can gradually stretch the thin skin in that area over years of repetition, contributing to looseness over time. Significant weight fluctuations also play a measurable role. When someone gains and then loses a substantial amount of weight, the skin around the eyes, like skin elsewhere on the body, doesn't always fully retract to its previous tightness, leaving behind extra folds that weren't there before. There are also specific medical conditions that can accelerate or exaggerate hooding beyond what typical aging alone would produce. Thyroid eye disease, for instance, can cause changes in the tissue around the eyes that lead to more pronounced hooding or swelling. Ptosis, a separate condition involving the drooping of the eyelid itself rather than just the skin above it, can sometimes be confused with hooded eyes, but actually involves the muscle responsible for lifting the eyelid, weakening or detaching slightly from its normal position. Researchers have also noted that certain medical treatments, including chemotherapy and radiation therapy, can accelerate the aging processes affecting the delicate skin around the eyes, sometimes causing hooding to develop and progress more rapidly than it would through natural aging alone. A reminder that skin around the eyes often reflects broader changes happening throughout the body, not just the passage of time on its own. There's also a temporary, less permanent version of eyelid puffiness and hooding that has nothing to do with either genetics or long-term aging. Fluid retention, often caused by high salt intake, allergies, sinus issues, lack of sleep, or simply the position you slept in overnight, can cause temporary swelling around the eyes that mimics the appearance of hooding. Unlike genetic or age-related hooding, this version typically resolves within hours once the underlying cause, whether that's dehydration, inflammation, or fluid buildup, is addressed. This is why some people notice their eyes look more hooded first thing in the morning, only to see the effect diminish somewhat as the day goes on and fluid redistributes. Sleep position plays a surprisingly large role in this temporary category as well. Lying flat overnight allows fluid to pool more easily around the eyes and upper face, simply because gravity isn't pulling it downward toward the rest of the body, the way it does when you're upright. People who sleep with their heads slightly elevated, whether through an extra pillow or an adjustable bed frame, often notice less morning puffiness as a result, since the fluid has less opportunity to settle in that delicate tissue overnight. Doctors studying this phenomenon have also pointed to alcohol consumption and high sodium meals eaten close to bedtime as common contributors, since both encourage the body to retain water in ways that show up most visibly in the thin, sensitive skin surrounding the eyes. So what does all of this add up to? When you look at hooded eyes through the combined lens of genetics, evolutionary biology, and the biology of aging, you start to see a far richer picture than the simple cosmetic narrative most people are used to. For some individuals, hooded eyes trace directly back to a single, specific genetic variant, one that arose tens of thousands of years ago somewhere in ancient Asia, possibly as a defense against searing heat and humidity, possibly as insulation against brutal cold, and possibly for reasons scientists haven't even considered yet. That variant didn't just reshape the eyelid, it rewired hair texture, tooth structure, sweat gland density, and facial architecture, all through one small change in a single gene, a genetic ripple effect that traveled from a tiny mutation in ancient DNA all the way to the faces of millions of people alive today. For others, hooded eyes have nothing to do with ancient migrations or climate adaptation at all. They're simply the visible result of decades of living, decades of collagen slowly breaking down, elastin gradually losing its bounce, brow muscles quietly losing strength, and gravity patiently doing what gravity always does. It's less a story about deep evolutionary history and more a story about the ordinary universal experience of getting older, something every single human being eventually goes through regardless of ancestry, ethnicity, or genetics. And for a smaller number of people, hooded eyes emerge from something else entirely, whether that's a medical condition altering tissue around the eyes, a treatment like chemotherapy, accelerating skin changes, or something as simple and temporary as too much salt the night before combined with too little sleep. What ties all of these threads together is something researchers keep emphasizing again and again. Hooded eyes are not a flaw. They're not evidence of tiredness, not a sign of aging badly, and certainly not something to be embarrassed about. They're one small but genuinely fascinating window into how varied, adaptable, and deeply layered human biology actually is. A fold of skin above your eye might carry within it evidence of where your ancestors lived tens of thousands of years ago. Evidence of how your particular body has aged over the decades, or simply evidence that you didn't sleep especially well last night. Often it's some combination of all three, layered on top of each other in ways that are unique to every single face. This is also part of why researchers are quick to push back against the outdated idea that any particular eyelid shape is somehow more normal or more desirable than another. Human eyelids exist along a wide spectrum, from fully hooded to prominently creased, from monolids with no visible fold at all to deep-set double lids, and every single variation along that spectrum is the product of legitimate, well-understood biological processes. None of them are mistakes. None of them are malfunctions. They're simply different expressions of the same underlying anatomical toolkit, shaped by different combinations of genetics, environment, and time. It's worth remembering, too, that scientists initially approached hooded eyes almost entirely from a cosmetic or medical treatment angle, focused mainly on procedures like blepharoplasty, a surgery that removes excess eyelid skin, or various injectable treatments designed to lift and tighten the brow area. Only in recent decades has serious research attention shifted toward the deeper genetic and evolutionary questions, toward understanding not just how to alter hooded eyes, but why they exist in the first place, and what that existence tells us about human history and adaptation. That shift matters because it moves the conversation away from treating a natural human trait as a problem in need of a solution, and toward genuinely appreciating it as a legitimate, fascinating piece of our shared biological story. It's also worth acknowledging just how deeply cultural attitudes have shaped the way hooded eyes and related traits have been perceived throughout history. In some regions, double eyelid surgery has become one of the most commonly requested cosmetic procedures, driven by beauty standards that favor a more prominent crease. Meanwhile, in other cultural contexts, hooded and monolid eyes have long been celebrated as distinctive, striking, and highly attractive features in their own right. Fashion and beauty trends have shifted back and forth over the decades, with hooded eyes moving in and out of favor depending on the era, the region, and whichever celebrities or public figures happen to be setting the aesthetic tone at any given moment. None of that back and forth changes the underlying biology, of course, but it does illustrate how a purely anatomical trait can become tangled up with shifting ideas about beauty, identity, and self-image, ideas that often have very little to do with the actual science sitting quietly underneath. So the next time you notice hooded eyes, whether in the mirror or on someone else's face, you're looking at something with real depth behind it. You might be looking at the living legacy of a genetic mutation that swept through an ancient population tens of thousands of years ago, quietly reshaping hair, teeth, and eyelids in the process. You might be looking at the natural universal signature of time passing, of collagen and elastin doing exactly what they do in every human body eventually. Or you might simply be looking at someone who didn't get quite enough sleep last night. Science still doesn't have every single answer nailed down, particularly around exactly why the EDAR variant spread so successfully and so quickly, whether heat, cold, or some entirely different pressure drove its rapid rise. But what researchers have already uncovered is more than enough to completely transform a feature that was once dismissed as a flaw into something recognized for what it truly is, a small, visible thread connecting every person alive today back through tens of thousands of years of human survival, adaptation, and change. And that, in the end, is the real story hiding behind hooded eyes. Not a flaw to correct, not a sign of exhaustion, but a genuine piece of evolutionary history written directly into the skin above your eyes, carried forward silently, generation after generation, until it eventually became a part of you. Somewhere in that fold of skin lives a story stretching back further than most of us ever pause to consider. A story involving migration across vast, unforgiving landscapes, survival against punishing climates, and a genetic code quietly rewriting itself in response to challenges we can barely imagine today. It's easy to walk past a face in the mirror every morning without thinking twice about what's written into it. But hooded eyes, in their own quiet way, are proof that even the smallest, most overlooked features of the human body can carry within them an entire chapter of our species' long, remarkable journey.